The final sound she heard from the life she had known was the click of a well-oiled lock. It was a small, definitive sound, a metal tongue sliding into a metal groove, but it carried the weight of an iron gate slamming shut on her past. Her uncle, Silas, stood on the other side of the polished oak door, his silhouette a dark shape against the warm light of the mercantile he now owned. He had not shouted. He had not been cruel in his tone. He had been something far worse, practical. 18 is a woman grown, Elara, he had said, his voice as smooth and cool as the coins he pressed into her palm. 20 silver dollars. Your parents left debts. The town has expectations. A girl alone. It is not proper. This settles the accounts. He had pushed a folded, yellowed document into her other hand. It was the deed to the old quarry claim up in the Granite Maw, a place her father had bought in a fit of optimistic foolishness years ago. It was considered the most worthless piece of land in the county, a jagged scar of rock and scree where nothing grew and the wind never stopped. It was a joke, a cautionary tale told to greenhorn prospectors. And now it was hers, her entire inheritance. She stood on the boardwalk of Prosperity Gulch, the dust of the street swirling around the hem of her worn dress. The coins felt heavy and cold, a miserly anchor to a world that no longer wanted her. The deed felt as brittle as her future. People watched from behind curtains and through shop windows. She saw pity in the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife. She saw cold satisfaction in the face of Mr. Davies, the rancher who had coveted her family's small pasture. Most just saw a problem that had been tidily removed. Sheriff Miller approached, his boots heavy on the wood. He was a man who preferred order over justice. Now, Elara, he began, his tone laced with a weary condescension. You could take that silver and buy a stage ticket east, find work in a city. No shame in it. This land is mine, she said, her voice quiet but not trembling. She held up the deed. He sighed, a puff of air that smelled of coffee and disappointment. That's no land. It's a pile of rocks, a hole in the ground. You can't live on granite and drink wind, girl. Be sensible. But sense had left her life the day the fever took her parents. All that remained was a cold, hard kernel of refusal. She would not run. She would not beg. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. She turned her back on the sheriff, on the watching eyes, on the warm, lamplit world behind the locked door. She walked to the far end of the street, to the blacksmith's forge, the heat a welcome shock against her chilled skin. The smithy, a burly man named Jeb, looked at her with gruff sympathy. Heard what Silas did. A damn shame. I need an axe, she said, laying 5 of her silver dollars on the anvil. A good one, and a shovel head. He picked up the coins, his calloused fingers gentle. He selected a felling axe with a straight-grained hickory handle and a heavy, well-balanced head. He found a sturdy shovel head, its edge still sharp. He added a small hand pick and a coil of rope to the pile. That's only worth $3, he grunted, pushing 2 coins back toward her. You'll need the rest. And take this. He handed her a heavy wool blanket, patched but clean. My wife will have my hide if I let you go up there with nothing but cotton on your back. Elara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She gathered her meager supplies, the weight of the axe a comfort in her hands. She did not look back at the town of Prosperity Gulch. She adjusted the blanket over her shoulder, gripped the axe handle, and began the long walk toward the Granite Maw, toward the worthless inheritance that was now her only home. The journey was a punishment. The gentle rolling hills around the town gave way to a landscape that grew progressively more hostile. The dirt path dwindled to a game trail, forcing its way through thorny scrub and skeletal, wind-twisted pines. The ground rose steeply, and the soil thinned until it was just a gritty dust over stone. The sun beat down, but the wind had a mountain chill that cut through her thin dress. Every step was an effort, the weight of the tools and blanket dragging at her shoulders, her worn shoes scraping against the sharp rock. By the second day, she was in the maw itself. It was a place aptly named. The mountains rose on either side like broken teeth, gray and unforgiving. The wind howled through the passes, a constant, mournful sound that scraped at the nerves. The silence between gusts was even more unnerving. A dead, breathless quiet where you could hear the frantic beat of your own heart. She saw no birds, no squirrels, only the occasional lizard skittering across a sun-baked rock. This was a land that had been scoured of life. She found the claim marker late in the afternoon, a rotting wooden post with her family's name carved into it, the letters faded and split. And she saw her inheritance. The town's mockery had been an understatement. It was a cliff face, a sheer wall of granite that had been blasted and quarried decades ago and then abandoned. At its base was a massive, chaotic jumble of fallen rock, boulders the size of cabins piled one on top of the other. This was the collapsed mine the deed described. It wasn't a mine. It was a grave. A wave of cold, absolute despair washed over her. It was a physical force, buckling her knees and stealing the air from her lungs. She sank to the ground, the sharp rocks digging into her skin. The town was right. The sheriff was right. This was impossible. There was no shelter here, no water, no hope. Just a tomb of stone under a vast, empty sky. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned her eyes, hot and bitter. She had traded the world for a pile of rubble. She had chosen this slow death out of pride. She sat there as the sun began to sink, the shadows of the peaks stretching like long, cold fingers across the valley. The temperature dropped with shocking speed. The wind grew sharper, a knife against her skin. She huddled in the lee of a large boulder, pulling Jeb's wool blanket tight around her. This was it, her first night, and possibly her last. The cold was a living thing, seeping into her bones. And then she felt it. A subtle, almost imperceptible difference. The rock she was leaning against was not radiating the day's heat. That was long gone. It was less cold. There was a strange stillness in the air right at its base, a pocket of calm in the relentless wind. She pressed her hand flat against the granite behind the boulder. It was cool, but not the biting, icy cold of the surrounding stones. Curiosity, a spark of the instinct that refused to die, stirred within her. She crawled on her hands and knees, following the base of the cliff face, feeling the stone. The rockfall was immense, a tangled mess of granite blocks. But as she moved deeper into the jumble, into the crevices between the giant boulders, the wind died completely. The air grew still, and it was warmer, definitely warmer. She squeezed through a narrow gap, scraping her shoulders, and found herself in a small, protected cavity formed by 3 massive, fallen slabs. She ran her hands along the cliff wall behind them. Here, the rock was almost temperate, and she could feel a faint, steady draft of air flowing out of a crack no wider than her hand. It was not a cold draft. It was mild, and it carried a strange, earthy smell, the scent of deep places, of damp soil and stone that had never seen the sun. She pressed her ear to the crack. She heard nothing but the blood rushing in her own head. But she could feel it, a slow, constant exhalation from the mountain itself. The collapsed mine wasn't just a pile of rubble. The rubble was a plug, and behind it, the mountain was breathing. despair did not vanish. It was driven back by something fiercer, a grim, desperate resolve. The town saw a tomb. She had found a secret. This worthless place had one hidden advantage. It was alive on the inside. And if it was, maybe she could be too. The work began at dawn. It was a brutal, punishing education in the physics of stone and leverage. Her tools were the axe, the shovel head she lashed to a sturdy branch, and the handpick. Her engine was nothing but the lean muscle of her own body, fueled by a handful of dried berries and a desperate will. The rockfall was a puzzle with pieces that weighed tons. She could not move the great boulders. Her task was to find a path through them, to clear the smaller, manageable stones that choked the gaps. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and baking, were shredded within the first hour. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, leaving raw patches of skin that seared with pain every time she gripped a tool or a sharp-edged rock. She learned to ignore the sting, to wrap her palms in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. Her muscles screamed in protest, a deep, burning ache in her back, her shoulders, her legs. She had never known this kind of exhaustion, a weariness so profound it felt like it was dissolving her bones. She worked in a focused silence, the only sounds the scrape of her shovel, the sharp clink of the pick against stone, and her own ragged breathing. Each rock she moved, each bucket of scree she hauled away, was a victory. She was not trying to clear the whole collapse. She was excavating a single, narrow path, following the source of that warm, breathing air. It was like digging her own grave in reverse. After 3 days of relentless labor, she had cleared a tunnel, a low, cramped passage that snaked through the heart of the rockfall. It led directly to the cliff face, to the crack. Using the pick and the butt of her axe, she attacked the fractured stone around the fissure. It was slow, agonizing work. Chips of granite flew, stinging her face. The jarring impacts traveled up her arms and shuddered through her entire body. But the crack widened, first to a fist, then to a hole big enough to push her head through. The air that flowed out was a revelation. It was humid and smelled of wet earth and limestone. It was a consistent, stable temperature, cool in the heat of the day, warm in the chill of the night. She hammered and pried until the opening was just wide enough to squeeze her body through. She wriggled into the darkness, the rough stones scraping her back, and emerged into a space beyond. She was not in a mine shaft. She was in a natural lava tube, a tunnel carved by ancient fire deep within the mountain. The floor was smooth in places, rough in others. The ceiling was a high, vaulted arch that vanished into the blackness above. The air was still and quiet, the howling of the wind a distant memory. And she could hear a sound, a slow, steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Following the sound, her hands tracing the cool, damp wall, she found its source. A seep of pure, clean water wept from a fissure in the rock, collecting in a small, natural basin on the floor. She knelt and drank, the water colder and sweeter than any she had ever tasted. It was the water of life, hidden in the heart of the stone. This would be her shelter. The rockfall itself formed a formidable insulating wall against the outside world. She spent the next week widening the entrance tunnel, making it high enough to walk through, stooped over. She used the stones she cleared to build a crude but solid wall on either side of the entrance, creating a small, protected antechamber within the rockfall itself. This was where she would live. The next system she needed was heat. The cave was temperate, but the mountain winters were brutal, capable of freezing a man solid in his own cabin. She could not have a fire inside the lava tube. The smoke would have nowhere to go. But as she explored the antechamber, she found another gift from the mountain. A thin, vertical fissure ran up the main cliff face, disappearing into the darkness above. It was a natural chimney. She built her hearth against that wall. She gathered flat stones, and using a mortar made from clay she found deeper in the cave, mixed with water from the seep, she painstakingly constructed a firebox and a flue that directed the smoke into the fissure. The first time she lit a fire, she held her breath, terrified the smoke would pour back into her living space. But it drew. A steady, thin plume of white smoke rose from the rockfall, up the cliff face, and was instantly torn to shreds by the relentless wind, invisible to any distant observer. The stone of the cliff face behind the fire grew warm, a huge thermal mass that absorbed the heat and radiated it back into the small chamber long after the flames died down. She had a hearth. She had warmth. With shelter and water and heat secured, her world began to take on a rhythm. But she was running out of food. The berries were gone. She had snared 2 rabbits, but it was not enough. She needed a sustainable source. And she had $17 silver left. It was time to return to Prosperity Gulch. The journey back was different. She was leaner, harder. Her hands were a mass of calluses. Her face was tanned and scratched. She moved with a new economy of motion, her body accustomed to the harsh terrain. When she walked down the main street of town, people stared. She was a wild thing, a creature of the mountains, not the girl they had cast out a month before. She walked directly into Silas's mercantile. He was behind the counter, polishing a lantern. He looked up, and for a moment, a flicker of shock crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of cool disdain. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the mountain hasn't eaten you yet. Come to your senses? Ready to buy that ticket east?" "I need supplies," she said, her voice even. She placed her silver on the counter. An iron pot, a bag of flour, salt, a side of bacon, and all the potato eyes, carrot seeds, and bean seeds you have. He raised an eyebrow. "Farming, are we? I'm told the topsoil in the maw is a bit thin." A few customers in the store snickered. The story of her folly was well known. They had already given her a name, the Maw Mouse. "Just the supplies," she repeated. He filled her order slowly, with a theatrical flourish, as if participating in a grand joke. "Anything else? Perhaps a plow? A team of oxen to pull it through the granite?" "Your 6 laying hens," she said, pointing to the crate by the door, "and the rooster." This drew outright laughter from the men loafing by the stove. Silas shook his head in mock pity. "Elara, the wolves will have those birds before the first night is out. It's a waste of good money." "They are my dollars to waste," she said. He took her money, his fingers brushing hers, his touch cold and dismissive. As she was tying the legs of the chickens together to carry them, a boy came in, maybe 10 years old, dragging a burlap sack. A whimpering sound came from inside. "Mr. Silas," the boy said. "Found him up by the creek. Legs broken, I think. Pa said to drown him." Silas barely glanced at it. "Then do it. I'm not running a kennel for strays." Elara looked at the sack. "I'll take him," she said. She handed the boy one of her last 2 silver dollars. He stared at the coin, then at her, and quickly handed over the sack. Silas scoffed. "Another mouth to feed. You have a fondness for lost causes, niece." "It seems to run in the family," she said, her words sharp enough to make him flinch. She gathered her supplies, the heavy sack of food, the squawking, indignant chickens, and the sack with the whimpering dog, and walked out of the store, the laughter of the town following her like a swarm of angry bees. She did not have a companion. Now she had 3. The chickens, once she got them back to the cave, were a noisy, feathered nuisance. The dog, a scruffy terrier mix with intelligent brown eyes, was a patient. She used her last strips of cloth and 2 straight sticks to set his broken leg. She named him Shale, for the broken rock he came from. He ate the scraps of bacon she gave him, and licked her calloused hand, his tail giving a weak thump against the stone floor. He was her first ally. The town's mockery about her farming attempts was logical, but their logic was based on the outside world. Elada's world was now inside the mountain. Deeper in the lava tube, beyond her living quarters, the air was consistently mild and humid. The floor was covered in a thick layer of volcanic dust and bat guano accumulated over centuries. It was rich, dark, and fertile. She spent 2 weeks hauling it, bucket by bucket, into a section of the cave she had walled off with stones. She created a series of long, raised beds. Then she brought in her most precious resource, soil. She found pockets of it in the crevices outside, washed down from the higher peaks. She hauled it in on her back, a grueling task that made her muscles burn. She mixed the rich topsoil with the cave dust, creating a perfect, loamy blend. In the dim, perpetual twilight of the cave, illuminated only by the flicker of her tallow lamp, she planted. She pressed the potato eyes into the dark earth. She sowed rows of carrot seeds and beans. In a special corner, she planted a few precious lettuce seeds she had found at the bottom of the seed packet. It seemed a foolish, hopeful act, growing delicate greens in the heart of a granite mountain. To her astonishment, it worked. The constant temperature, the high humidity, the absence of wind and pests, and the nutrient-rich soil created a perfect, stable environment. Within weeks, pale green shoots pushed through the soil. The beans snaked their way up strings she had hung from the ceiling. The potato plants grew bushy and strong. It was a secret garden, a hidden world of life thriving in the darkness. Her chickens, secured in a pen built of scavenged wood and stones, began to lay eggs. Their cheerful clucking was a warm, living sound in the silence of the stone. Shale's leg healed, and he became her shadow, a vigilant, devoted guardian. His sharp bark was an alarm system, and his warm body pressed against her at night was a comfort against the profound solitude. Winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. The first snows came in November, and by December, the granite maw was buried. The wind became a physical presence, a shrieking monster that clawed at the rockfall, searching for a way in. The cold was a thing of terrible power, a pressure that could crack stone and freeze the marrow in a man's bones. The world outside Elada's shelter ceased to exist. It was just a swirling chaos of white and gray, a place of certain death. Inside, her world was small, warm, and ordered. Her days fell into a simple, life-sustaining rhythm. Wake, tend the fire, feed the chickens, collect the eggs. Water the garden by lamplight, her breath fogging in the cool air. Check her snares at the sheltered edge of the rockfall. Cook her meal, usually a potato, an egg, and a piece of rabbit or salted bacon. Grind flour for a small, dense loaf of bread baked on a hot stone by the fire. Mend her clothes. Talk to Shale. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of a hidden kingdom the size of a single room and a dark garden. She had food, water, warmth, and shelter. She had built it all from nothing, with her own 2 hands. The mockery of the town, the condescension of her uncle, felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. Her systems were tested. A pack of starving wolves, drawn by the scent of the chickens, spent a week circling the rockfall, their howls echoing in the night. Shale's ferocious barking from within the protected entrance kept them at bay until they finally moved on. A midwinter thaw caused a torrent of meltwater to cascade down the cliff face, but her carefully constructed entrance diverted it, the water flowing around her shelter, not into it. She learned, she adapted, she endured. The Maw Mouse was safe in her hole. In late January, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind died into an ominous silence. Even the ever-present mountain breeze held its breath. Ilara, watching from a small, chinked opening in her wall, felt a primal fear. She had seen storms. This was something else. This was a threat. She brought extra firewood into the antechamber, checked the seals on her makeshift door, and ensured the animals were secure. She trusted the mountain. She did not trust the sky. The blizzard of '83 hit that night. It did not arrive with a roar, but with a suffocating weight. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The wind that followed was like a physical blow, a battering ram of ice and fury. It was a storm that did not just cover the world, but sought to erase it. It screamed like a banshee through the peaks of the Maw, the sound of mountains being torn apart. Inside her shelter, Ilara felt the vibrations through the stone. She heard the distant, thunderous crack of ancient pines snapping in two. But the direct assault of the wind could not reach her. The tons of rock in the fall absorbed its force, breaking it, silencing it. Her fire burned steady and calm, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure chimney. The air in her chamber was warm. The chickens roosted peacefully. Shale slept by the hearth, twitching in a dream. She was in the eye of the hurricane, a tiny island of warmth and life in a world of frozen chaos. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. For 3 days the world ended. The snow piled up, burying the landscape in a deep white tomb. In Prosperity Gulch, it was a catastrophe. The town had been built with the arrogance of men who thought they had tamed the land. They were wrong. The blizzard was a force of nature that shattered their illusions. The roof of the livery stable collapsed under the weight of the snow, killing half the horses inside. The great, stained glass window of the church, which had survived 50 winters, exploded inward, showering the pews with frozen shrapnel. Houses built of milled lumber groaned and cracked. The wind found every gap, every poorly chinked log, and poured in like a river of ice. Firewood, stacked carelessly in open-sided sheds, was buried under impenetrable drifts. Families huddled together in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive. The town's confidence, its very structure, was breaking apart. On the 4th day, the wind lessened, though the snow still fell thick and heavy. The silence from the outside world was absolute. It was the silence of a world buried. Ilara was checking the lashing on her door when Shale suddenly stood up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His ears were cocked, listening to something she could not hear. Then she heard it. A faint, desperate banging from the outside. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. She listened again. It was real. A frantic, weak thudding against the outer rocks of her shelter. Someone was out there. Someone had found her. With Shale barking furiously beside her, she unbarred her door and pushed her way into the narrow tunnel through the rockfall. The snow had packed into the entrance, and she had to dig her way through the last few feet. When she finally broke through, a figure collapsed into the opening, a ghost covered in ice and snow. She dragged the person inside, into the warmth of the antechamber. As she brushed the snow from his face, her heart stopped. It was a boy, no older than 16, his face blue with cold, his breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. It was Thomas, her cousin, Silas's son. He had followed her, she realized. He must have known the general location of the claim. He had come seeking the Maw Mouse in her hole as a last, desperate resort. The moral choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. She stripped off his frozen coat and wrapped him in her own blankets, forcing sips of warm broth between his chattering teeth. He was barely conscious, muttering deliriously. "The town, no wood," he whispered, his eyes wild with fever and fear. "Lily, she's so cold. Father, he sent me. Said, the folly. Maybe—" His voice trailed off as he succumbed to exhaustion. The folly. Silas had sent his son into a killing storm, pinning his last hope on the foolish girl he had exiled. The irony was as bitter as the wind outside. She looked at her carefully rationed supplies. Her firewood, stacked high, would last her another month. Her garden was full. Her stores were meant for one person and a dog. But the image of a child, Lily, her youngest cousin, freezing in the dark, erased all calculation. She worked quickly. She loaded a small, sturdy sled she had built from scavenged lumber. She piled it high with firewood, dense, seasoned pine that would burn hot and long. She went into her garden and, with a sharp knife, harvested her impossible crop. She pulled carrots from the soil, their color a shocking orange against the gray stone. She cut heads of pale green lettuce and bundled them. She filled a sack with potatoes. This was her wealth, her survival, and she was giving it away. She dressed in every layer she owned, wrapped her face in cloth, and tied the rope from the sled around her waist. She looked at Thomas, sleeping fitfully by the fire. Then she looked at Shale. "Watch him," she commanded. The dog seemed to understand. He lay down beside the boy, a furry, vigilant guardian. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the white hell of the storm, leaning into the wind and pulling her cargo of warmth and life back toward the town that had left her for dead. The journey was a nightmare. The world was a trackless, featureless expanse of white. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, heavy powder that fought her every step. The wind howled, driving ice crystals into her exposed skin like needles. She navigated by instinct, by the vague shape of the peaks she could glimpse through the swirling snow, by the memory of the land beneath her feet. Several times she fell, the sled tipping, and had to fight to right it, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning from the frozen air. She was not a person. She was a single, stubborn point of warmth and will, moving through a universe of cold. It took her hours to cover the distance a raven could fly in minutes. When she finally saw the first buried rooftops of Prosperity Gulch, she was stumbling, her vision blurring from exhaustion. She did not aim for the main street. She aimed for the back of the mercantile, for the family entrance. She fell against the door, too weak to knock, and it swung open. Silas was there, his face a gray mask of terror. He had been watching, waiting, praying. He saw her, a figure of snow and ice, and then he saw the sled. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in profound, shattering shock. He stared at the firewood. Then he stared at the fresh, green lettuce resting on top of the pile, a thing so impossible in this frozen world that it might as well have been a miracle. Men from the neighboring houses, drawn by the commotion, came and helped her pull the sled into the mercantile's main room. People gathered, their faces gaunt and smudged with soot from burning green wood. They were freezing, starving, and defeated. They stared at the food she had brought, their eyes hungry and bewildered. Where had it come from? How could this be? Silas fell to his knees. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a carrot, as if to confirm it was real. He looked from the impossible harvest to the face of the girl he had thrown out. His pride, the rigid pillar of his life, crumbled into dust. "We were wrong," he whispered, the words choked with a shame so deep it was a physical agony. "My God, Ilara, we called you a fool. We were the fools." Ilara stood there, leaning on the doorframe for support, the melting snow dripping from her clothes onto the floor. She felt no triumph. She felt no satisfaction in his humiliation. She only felt a vast, bone-deep weariness. She looked at the huddled, shivering people, at the frightened faces of their children. "There is food," she said, her voice raw and quiet. "Build up the fire. Eat." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not demand an apology. Her grace was in her actions. She showed them how to bank the fire to conserve wood. She gave the greens to the mothers for their children. She handed a potato to a stunned Mr. Davies, the rancher. Her victory was not in their defeat, but in her simple, quiet act of providing. She had become what the town was named for, but had forgotten how to be: a source of prosperity in the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land. The storm broke the next day. The blizzard of '83 became a legend, a benchmark of hardship against which all other winters were measured. But the story that was told most often was not of the storm itself, but of the girl who walked out of it. In the immediate aftermath, the community's relationship with Ilara was transformed. They did not come with pity, but with awe. They brought her tools, cloth, and livestock for trade, not as charity, but as a fair exchange for the impossible vegetables she grew in the dark. They came to learn. Silas, a humbled and diminished man, was the first. He asked her to show him how she had built her hearth, how she had used the very stone of the mountain to trap the heat. Others followed, and soon the simple, resilient principles of her shelter began to appear in town. New root cellars were dug deeper. New homes were built with a stone wall facing the wind, using the earth itself as insulation. The name Maw Mouse was never spoken again. Instead, they called her place the Hold, and they spoke of it with a kind of reverence. It was the place that had held fast when everything else broke. Travelers passing through Prosperity Gulch carried the story with them, and the tale of the woman who gardened inside a mountain spread through the territories, becoming a new kind of frontier legend, one not of conquest and gold, but of ingenuity and survival. Ilara never moved back to town. The Hold was her home, the place she had made with her own hands. But she was no longer in exile. She became the quiet, steady heart of the community, a source of wisdom and strength. Her secret garden fed the town through 2 more hard winters and a summer drought. Her knowledge saved lives. She had been stripped of everything, cast out with nothing but a worthless piece of land, and in that nothing she had found everything. Years later, she would stand at the entrance to her home, the aged dog Shale resting at her feet, and look out over the granite maw. The wind still blew, and the rock was still unforgiving, but it was no longer a hostile place. It was her partner, her fortress, her provider. She had learned its secrets not by blasting it apart, but by listening to its quiet breath. She had built more than a shelter, she had built a life, proving that the greatest strength is not found in what you can take from the world, but in what you can create in the places it has abandoned.